25 years ago, the Soviet nuclear submarine K-219 sank. The causes of the accident have not yet been made public. On October 4, 1986, the newspaper Pravda published a short TASS report. On the morning of October 3, a fire broke out in one of the compartments of a Soviet nuclear submarine with ballistic missiles on board in an area about 1,000 kilometers northeast of Bermuda. The crew of the submarine and approaching Soviet ships are eliminating the consequences of the fire. There are injured on board the submarine. 3 people died. The commission concluded that there is no danger of unauthorized weapons action, nuclear explosion, and radioactive contamination of the environment. In fact, 4 people were killed, and 4 more sailors later died. 2 days later, the boat sank in the Atlantic Ocean at a depth of 5,500 meters. What happened? The Crazy Ivan Maneuver. On September 3, 1986, the strategic nuclear submarine cruiser K-219 left the Gadzevo military base and headed for the U.S. coast, where it was to perform combat duty with 15 nuclear missiles on board. The commander of the nuclear-powered ship, Captain First Rank Igor Britanov, took a number of stealth measures during the crossing. He camouflaged himself in the noise of an associated dry cargo ship, carefully avoided the technical means of the American Hydroacoustic Submarine Detection System SOSUS installed on the seabed. However, K-219 was still detected in the area of Iceland, and the U.S. Navy Command received information about the entrance of an unknown submarine in the Atlantic. Toward the Soviet boat, as it later became clear, came the American submarine. On October 3, a few hours before entering the patrol area, the Los Angeles-class submarine USS Augusta, SSN 710, made hydroacoustic contact 680 miles northeast of Bermuda. Captain First Rank Britanov applied a special maneuver, Americans call it Crazy Ivan, in order to detect the next enemy boat in the keel. At that moment, a blow occurred, missile silo number 6 depressurized and water rushed into it. When it interacted with rocket fuel components, an explosive mixture was formed. An explosion occurred that destroyed the outer wall of the rocket's solid body and plutonium warheads. Some parts of the missile flew out to sea, the rest fell inside the cruiser and, in reaction with the water, began to produce poisonous gases. 2 minutes after the explosion, the commander of K-219 managed to raise the nuclear submarine to the surface of the water. The crew left the half-submerged, gassed-forth missile compartment and closed the sealed bulkheads. Fight for survivability. The battle for the cruiser's survivability began. At first, sailors managed to reduce the spread of poisonous impurities from the emergency fourth to other compartments. But through the damaged mains and pipelines on the boat still slowly spread poisonous fog. In some places the level of pollution exceeded the maximum permissible level by 2,000 to 3,000 times. Several attempts were made to drain the fuel components and pump the rocket silo with seawater. But they were unsuccessful. The emergency party and special equipment managed to get into the fourth compartment and take out the bodies of the dead. After 14 hours of continuous struggle for the life of the ship, fire broke through to the fifth compartment. Soon the emergency protection of the reactors was triggered. In this case, the compensating grids, shutting down the reactor, should automatically go down. However, they froze. No power was supplied to their drive motors, and the cables were burned out. Now it was necessary to shut down the reactor at any cost. There could be a nuclear explosion at any moment. And the case, by the way, was very close to the coast of the United States. Someone had to take the ultimate risk. Nikolai Belikov, the group commander, was the first to go to the emergency compartment. He went down to the reactor cover. He unscrewed the lock nut on one of the CR manual lowering actuators, inserted a special key, and managed to lower the first grate. But the high temperature in the reactor room made itself felt. Belikov, barely back in the next compartment, lost consciousness. After waking up, the officer went back to the reactor compartment with sailor Sergei Preminin. Together they lowered 2 more grids on the lower end. And again, going out for a break in the neighboring compartment, Belikov lost consciousness. Sergei Preminin, eternal memory to him, alone once again reached the reactor and manually shut down the last grate. He could not go back out. The raging fire cut off his way to life. The guy burned to death, preventing a nuclear catastrophe 10 times worse than Hiroshima. After 77 hours of struggle for the survivability of the boat, it became clear that it could not be saved. The crew moved to a rescue vessel that arrived at the disaster point. The last to leave the boat was its commander, captain of the second-rank Britanov at 11.00 on October 6. At 11.03 K2-19 sank, carrying the body of sailor Sergei Preminin, a simple boy from the village of Skorniakovo, near Veliki Ustyug, the third and youngest son in a peasant family. Why the tragedy was silenced. Despite the glasnost that began in the country, the people did not learn about the feat of Sergei Preminin. The fact is that already in mid-October the American press leaked a report that a U.S. Navy nuclear submarine on patrol in the Atlantic Ocean suffered hull damage as a result of a collision with an underwater object. At that time Gorbachev was preparing for a meeting with Reagan in Reykjavik, and the tragedy was classified. True, there was a decree of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR on July 23, 1987, for courage and bravery shown in the performance of military duty, to award the Order of the Red Star to Sergei Anatolievich Preminin, sailor, posthumously. But with what it was connected, few people knew. Captain of the second-rank Britanov was quietly dismissed from the armed forces. The crew of K2-19 was also quietly disbanded. Few military sailors doubt that the disaster occurred as a result of a collision with an American submarine. When after the explosion the boat surfaced in the surface position and was stripped of the upper hatch, the senior assistant commander Captain Sergei Vladimirov found along the left side, from the emergency shaft and further aft, a double furrow, casting a metallic sheen. Other members of the crew noticed her as well. Where did it come from? Specialists have not found a convincing explanation. Some assume that it is the result of the impact of the torn-off cover of the emergency shaft. Others, citing calculations, prove that the fresh trace on the metal could not have been drawn by the lid, that the matter did not do without the impact of a foreign object, perhaps even a foreign submarine. However, the American press indirectly confirms this version. Here, for example, what the Washington Post wrote: American submarine experts confirmed that even before Gorbachev informed Reagan about what happened, the US already knew about what happened on the Soviet submarine. Although they were unwilling to disclose details about who first transmitted the accident report, it is likely that it came from a US submarine tracking the Soviet submarine. In those October days in the American press, the accident on our submarine was covered with a touch of sensationalism, but in general the information was balanced. Local newspapers sometimes leaked some details. For example, that in the first half of October 1986, the U.S. Navy submarine Augusta during patrols in the Atlantic received hull damage as a result of collision with an underwater object and arrived at the home port of New London, Connecticut, for repair work in a dry dock. It was stated that the inspection revealed damage to the forward part of the hull and the hydroacoustic station fairing. A strictly limited number of specialists from a private firm were involved in the repair of the submarine. U.S. Navy officials refused to comment on the incident. By the way, 15 years later the situation was completely repeated with the repair of the American nuclear submarine Groton after the loss of the nuclear submarine Kursk. At that time, if we recall, at first news agencies with reference to sources in NATO headquarters and the U.S. administration reported that there were 2 U.S. submarines in the area of the Kursk accident, as well as the U.S. Navy reconnaissance ship Loyal 2. However, later Pentagon and NATO officials began to deny this information. Meanwhile, the day after the Kursk accident, Russian technical reconnaissance equipment made a radio interception. The U.S. submarine Memphis requested permission to make an emergency call to Norway for repairs. When this information became available to the Western press, there was first a denial and then a not very convincing explanation by the Norwegian authorities that the repair of the American boat was planned, but what exactly is being repaired on the submarine, by what forces and where exactly, is still hidden from the media. And that's not surprising. The history of submarine collisions shows that no one has ever admitted to having rammed a foreign submarine. Nevertheless, sooner or later the secret documents of naval staffs, keeping information about these cases, become public. The tragedy of K2-19 will probably not be an exception. Underwater confrontation. By the way, after the Kremlin achieved friendship with America, the underwater confrontation between our fleets has not become less severe. On February 11, 1992, the Soviet nuclear submarine B-276 and the American Baton Rouge rammed into each other. On March 20, 1993, the Russian submarine strategic missile cruiser K-407 and the U.S. nuclear submarine Grayling collided. Admiral Igor Kasatonov in his memoirs The Fleet Went to the Ocean writes, 20 underwater collisions, to a large extent due to the fault of the Americans, have occurred recently. One might get the impression that only our boats suffer most of the time as a result of underwater collisions. This is not the case at all. We simply know almost nothing about the consequences of collisions for the American side, commented the well-known rescuer Rear Admiral Yuri Senitsky. Our strategic rival, of course, classifies such information. But I, for example, know of a case when the Soviet K-306 rammed the American Patrick Henry so hard that it surfaced and the crew began to fight vigorously for survivability. K-19 in one blow laid the American boat Ghetto on the bottom of the Barents Sea. Then only a miracle saved the Americans from death. So, in an underwater collision the chances of both sides are approximately equal, if the tonnage is commensurate. However, much depends on what parts of the boats are in contact with each other. Say, the one who hits the keel, of course, has an advantage. It is for this reason that the large tonnage K-219 or Kursk, 24,000 tons of displacement, could get the heaviest hole from a collision with a medium tonnage. The Americans, for example, have no boats over 8,000 tons of submarine displacement, Submarine.